How should we respond to John Rich's attacks on Darby and C.I. Scofield? Hi, I'm Ken Yates from Grace Evangelical Society, and I'd like to address that issue for just a few minutes, along with a couple of clips that the country music star John Rich made, or some comments that he made in a recent interview. As I said, John Rich is a famous country music star, and he's also a very vocal Christian. He expresses his beliefs publicly. He's not ashamed of them. And recently he was doing an interview with Tucker Carlson on a podcast, and they were talking about dispensationalism, particularly the rapture of the church, the pre-tribulation rapture of the church. And he talks about Darby, one of the early Plymouth Brethren, and then C.I. Scofield, who's famous for the Scofield Reference Bible, that also promoted Darby's teaching about the pre-trib rapture of the church, that the church was going to be taken out of the world before the tribulation that's going to come upon the earth. And John Rich has a number of things to say about that doctrine, the rapture of the church before the tribulation, and Darby and C.I. Scofield's teaching of it. So let's show the first clip and see what John Rich has to say.
It says we don't know exactly when.
Okay, so can you, and I get at least once a day someone coming by my house and leaving me something about the end times, and which I appreciate, of course. And no, I'm actually serious.
Sure.
And every single day. And that's great. And I met a lot of the people, and that couldn't be nicer. But in some of the stuff that they leave, which I read actually, there's a sense that like we can predict through numerology, for example, like the day history's ending.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying we can't.
No, the Bible says we can't. I'm not saying anything. The Bible says no man knows the time nor the hour when Jesus will return. And that's correct. Nobody knows. Can I back up 200 years with you real quick?
Do.
I know you love history.
Yes.
200 years ago, basically, in 1830, a very wealthy, very charismatic preacher named John Darby, D-A-R-B-Y, came with this doctrine that's now referred to as the secret rapture or the pre-tribulation rapture. And that message took off. Why wouldn't it? I mean, who doesn't want to hear that we'll all be out of here before anything bad happens? That's a great message. That'll pack the pews right there. I love it. And it allowed them to say, for all we know, the rapture could happen before this church service ends right now, so you better move. And I guess to that end, it had a great effect. A lot of people got saved over that. A few decades after that, a guy named C.I. Scofield. Have you ever heard of a Scofield Bible?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So C.I. Scofield was basically a student of John Darby, and he adopted that part of the doctrine, and he incorporated that into the Bible. It was the first Bible ever made that had study notes with it. We have all kinds of Bibles now that have, concordances and study notes and all kinds of stuff that go along, but this was the first one that was ever made. It became so popular. Every Christian was reading it. Every minister was reading it. And this continues today, to this exact second. My own dad, when he went in seminary and was, wanting to become a minister, they said, make sure you have a Scofield Bible now when you come to class. Have your Scofield Bible. Scofield Bible also adopted that entire John Darby philosophy of Christians will not be here when the bad stuff starts to happen. And most Christians still believe that. Matter of fact, a lot of my friends that are Christians are going to watch this interview are probably right now going, hang on a minute. Now hang on. So this is pushing back against a doctrine that's been in existence now for coming up on 200 years. The problem with that doctrine is there's several places in the Bible where it talks about what's going to happen prior to Jesus Christ coming back to the earth. When he does come back, that is when what we call the rapture happens. The word rapture is nowhere in the Bible. It talks about us being caught up with him and pulled out of here, and then the ultimate wrath is poured out on this planet. That's what we call the rapture. So that's not in debate. The question is, what happens leading up to that? It's a good question to ask, right? For some reason, nobody ever preaches that. They don't want to talk about what all happens prior to it. So if I can I just read if we have time? That's why I love the thought of this interview.
I do too. But just to be clear, what you're saying is the Scofield Bible, its theology is deceptive.
I'm saying that the same way the media takes a factual situation and twists it and gives you a version of it, which we all know we're force-fed every single day, the same exact tactic was used in 1830 by John Darby. And guess who he was connected to, by the way? The Rothschilds.
Interesting.
Yeah, he was connected to the Rothschilds family back in the day. That he did the same exact tactic and twisted that. I don't know why he did that. It worked because it took off. And I mean, there were churches popping up everywhere right after that. I'm saying that, including me, including my own father, for a long time, that's what we believe too. But when you start actually going back and reading line by line by line what is said that will be leading up to Jesus coming back, which is when the rapture happens, it's the inverse of what John Darby put down.
You can see that John Rich is not a fan of the pre-tribulation rapture. Although he, for a number of years, and his own father believed in it, he uses words that Darby twisted the truth, that there was deception involved in that. And even though he doesn't come right out and say it, it's pretty clear that he implies that one of the reasons that Darby and Scofield held to this position was that it was popular, that it, to use his words, filled the pews. And the implication is that Darby and Scofield, now John Rich says, now I don't know his motives, but the implication is that Darby and Scofield did these things for their own benefit, that the Scofield Reference Bible became very popular, reading between the lines. Scofield became rich off of it. They certainly became famous off it. And he even mentions, John Rich does, that Darby was rich and that he was associated with the Rothschilds. Now, he doesn't say it, but it's clear that being associated with the Rothschilds is not a good thing. And then he says that this teaching of the rapture and that the church will not go through the tribulation is not in the Bible. He mentions that the word rapture does not occur in the New Testament. Well, the Greek word caught up does occur, and then when it was translated into Latin from Greek, the Latin word for rapture occurs. So certainly the concept and the Greek word for rapture is in there, but he implies that because it doesn't occur, then it's just something that Darby and C.I. Scofield and people today who promote the rapture of the church and the pre-trib rapture of the church, and that the church will not go through the tribulation, are promoting something that's not in the Bible. And then John Rich makes another point about what about all the things that lead up to the rapture that people do not preach, that people ignore who hold to this doctrine. Well, he doesn't go into what those things are, but it's clear that John Rich is equating the second coming of the Lord, and there's things that lead up to the second coming of the Lord, such as the man of sin, the mark of the beast that John Rich does talk about, and the rapture. And I'm not sure what John Rich would say, but he would say that those two are the same things. And he doesn't see a distinction that the church is going to be raptured, and then all those things are going to happen, and then the Lord is going to return. I think it's safe to say that John Rich has a problem with the teachings of Darby and the Scofield Reference Bible and dispensationalism and the rapture of the church, and that the church will not go through the tribulation. Because he mentions it a couple times, one of the problems he has is that it's something that is recent. He mentions 200 years ago. And what he's implying is that this is something that is new. You know, the church has been here for 2,000 years, and Darby comes up with this roughly 200 years ago. But when we use that, and that's a common attack against dispensationalism and the pre-trib rapture of the church. But if we use that as an argument that it can't be true because it's recent, well, what about the Reformation itself? You know, for 1,500 years, we had the Catholic Church teaching that you had to be baptized to be saved. You had 1,500 years where people said you had to take the Lord's Supper to be saved. You had 1,500 years where the church, the vast majority of people, were saying you could lose your salvation, and that salvation from the lake of fire was not by grace, but it was by works. And then the Reformation came and people started questioning that. Well, if we take this idea that something new or something that other people are not teaching cannot be true, and that's what John Rich is doing with the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, then the same thing would be true about salvation by grace. Now, we believe that there were always people who understood that throughout church history, but by far, the vast majority of the teachings for 1,500 years was, no, you have to do all these works, you have to go to the church, you got to get grace from the church in order to be saved. Just because something is new or seems to be new, or because it's a minority position, it can't be true. That's not the case. So we can't discard the rapture of the church because, you know, supposedly Darby brought this to light just 200 years ago. And then the other thing that John Rich is implying is that Darby and Scofield and people like them had ulterior motives. They twisted it. They twisted the scriptures. They deceived people. Tucker Carlson says, well, it's a lie. And so we question the motives of these men. And John Rich, a couple places, says, well, he was rich. He was associated with the Rothschild. So what's being implied there? That he was doing it for money? You know, and so we can look at the character of the people who teach a particular doctrine and say, well, their character isn't what it should be. So, you know, we ought to reject what they are teaching. I remember years ago, John Walvoord saying in chapel at Dallas Seminary, don't look too closely at the men you look up to because you'll find that they all have feet of clay. Let's say that Darby and C.I. Scofield were not the greatest examples of men. I don't know if that's true or not. If we do that, you know, Luther supposedly was an anti-Semite. Calvin had his opponents in some cases put to death because of disagreements in doctrine. So do we look at them and say, well, look at these guys, you can't go with anything they say? Or when you look at across history, when you look at great teachers of the Bible, even today, I don't care what theological stripe you are, if you look at people and you say, well, if they're immoral men, or if I hear something about them, then what they say cannot be true. No, we ought to judge what Darby and Scofield said based upon what the scriptures have to say. And now if I could just shift gears a little bit on this interview that John Rich did with Tucker Carlson, there's another clip where he talks about the danger of what Darby and Scofield had to say. And I'd like to watch that clip next. It's a short one, but here it is. Let's watch the second clip.
So why is it dangerous right now that Christians have this idea that they're going to be out of here before any of the things that are prophesied about happen? Why is that dangerous? It's dangerous because when the mark of the beast shows up, when the son of perdition shows up, who we refer to as the Antichrist, when those things happen and they're still here, they'll say, well, that can't be the mark of the beast. That can't be the Antichrist because I'm still here. And what danger does that put someone in? That's not the mark of the beast because I'm still here. So go ahead, sign me up. Think about the level of danger with that. And it has not existed, in my opinion, until recently, since technology has gotten to the point to actually execute these things.
Do you catch what John Rich says? One of the reasons he opposes the pre-tribulation rapture of the church is because he fears that when Christians do go through the tribulation of the church, they're going to accept the mark of the beast. And he goes, it's dangerous. And what he's saying there is that if you are a Christian and you go through the tribulation and you take the mark of the beast, what he's saying is you're going to lose your salvation. Well, you can't lose your salvation. And I wish and I hope that John Rich would step back and go, wait a second, my theology is really messed up here. So as you look at what John Rich has to say about the tribulation, about the rapture of the church, take these things into consideration. He's worried that Christians will lose their salvation. He's worried because this rapture of the church and that the church will miss the tribulation is a new teaching, and that it was promoted by men that maybe were not the most high quality in character. But none of that matters. What matters is, what do the scriptures say? And I will tell you, in John Rich's case, his theology that you can lose your salvation is completely contrary to the scriptures. And I would say his confusion of the rapture of the church and the second coming is as well. Let the scriptures decide. We're going to hear a lot of attacks on the rapture of the church, the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, and dispensationalism. But what I would encourage all the listeners to do is search the scriptures and decide for yourself. If you like this video, I'd ask that you press the like button and the subscribe button. And remember, keep grace in focus.